Hey everybody, my name's Alex. It's an honor and pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dev, and thank you to everybody in the USENIX committee for letting me be here, which I know was probably a pretty sketchy thing for them. So I do appreciate them taking the risk on doing it. I'm a little nervous today, right? So this is not my normal crowd. I actually have been looking forward to this talk very much. And I know you're wondering why. You're saying, Alex, I follow you on Twitter. You're obviously a megalomaniac and will take any kind of press in any situation. Why would you not want to do a talk like this? Well, there's a couple reasons, right? So the first is that last year, this keynote speech was given by Dr. James Mickens. Is Dr. Mickens here, actually? No? Of course. Why would he come to a talk that I gave? So I don't know how I could possibly live up to the standard that this guy set. Giving a talk, a keynote after James Mickens is kind of like somebody dating Alex Stamos after being dumped by John Stamos. Really, my only move here is the same thing I would do in this situation, which is I need to be supportive of the difficult time all of you are going through with the incredible letdown and expectations from what you're used to. So I'll just say, I understand what you're going through. I'm sorry that you have to put up with me. He didn't dump you, Mickens didn't dump you because of you. He has to go through his own process. This is about him, really. And really, Mickens hasn't been in anything famous since Full House, so let's kind of move on, right? Let's give me a chance. The other issue is, I've realized while putting this talk together is I haven't really had an original thought in the last 3 years. And now that I'm in academia, people care a lot about plagiarism, including a term that I didn't know existed until recently, self-plagiarism. And so I am a little worried about repeating myself and that I'll have difficulty saying anything that I haven't said before. So I just want to put that up front, that a lot of things I'm going to talk about today I have talked about before, but I thought I could pull them together in a new way for this audience. I know this photo is freaking you out because it's so incredibly realistic. This is actually a new kind of deep fake. This is a GAN that was trained off of my 7-year-old using MS Paint. So you'll be seeing that paper later. And now that I'm in academia, the standards for these kinds of talks are very different, right? I used to not care that much about what people holding me to an academic standard, but clearly now all of you are my colleagues, and I'm going to have to live up to the expectations set by the august institution that I'm part of. As you heard Dev said, my title when I joined Stanford was Adjunct Professor, and as all of you know, the term adjunct is Latin for not really a. In fact, Stanford has gotten rid of the entire title now, so I can't even call myself that. That's how bad I was when I came in, is that they eliminated an entire class of position at the university thanks to me taking it on. And that really, being part of the academic unwashed, not having a PhD, having gone to a public school, really makes me a little bit nervous about representing Stanford. In fact, oh my God, what is that? Computer enhance? Oh no, is it true? Enhance again. Oh yes, it's famous computer scientist John Hennessy in full academic regalia looking down and judging me already for this talk. I feel, I'm sorry John, I'm trying to do much better for you, sir. So why am I doing this talk even though I clearly don't want to do it? Well, the truth is that we're not doing so hot. And for we, I mean a big collective we of the general tech universe, right? That means the companies that build the products that are part of our lives, the nerds who are part of those companies, and the academic institutions that have spit them out so successfully over the last 20 years. This is pretty clear in the way that the public is treating us. I'm sure a lot of people in here have seen Silicon Valley, the show, right? That there's an entire show on HBO that is making fun of tech. Now, the existence of the show in the beginning was actually really interesting. It was an interesting statement on the power that our industry now has in our society, and that HBO would put millions and millions of dollars in lampooning all of these weird inside jokes of our industry, right? So just like media, just like Hollywood, just like politics, we now earned our own satirical HBO show. But if you've been watching Silicon Valley since the beginning, the tone has changed a bit. And for all of you young people in the audience, I hope that you too can have a career where one day your personal failings become a sight gag for an HBO show. But if you watch it, the tone of how people are treating us in the Valley is becoming very, very different and very dark. And that's something that we have to take some responsibility for, and I think we got to look at the big picture of why we've gone here. And the truth is there's still some fundamental problems with how we talk, how we teach, how we handle and operationalize security in the world we live in now. We have inserted technology into every aspect of people's lives, right? That everything people do is now been revolutionized over the last 10 years by information technology. And yet our understanding of the impacts it have on people and how do we keep them safe online has far from kept up. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of these fundamental problems and some ways that I think we can now together address them. One of the first ones is that we as both in academia and in industry are still way too in love with complexity as the thing that drives our interest and what we work on in security. So here's a place where I am directly ripping myself off in that I'm going to use something that I talked about a couple of years ago, but nothing's changed, so why should I, is my theory here. And something I've learned coming in academia is the way to make yourself truly famous is to name a law after yourself, name a balancing test, name some kind of theorem. And so I am trying to make this happen, the Stamos hierarchy of the actual bad stuff that happens online to real people. So I'd really appreciate if you'd cite me on this in your papers going forward, and that you'd use the entire non-abbreviated title for this idea that I'm talking about today. So imagine that this triangle represents all of the bad things that happen to people online. It turns out the vast, vast majority of the human harm, of the people who are actually suffering in their lives because of tech, are suffering because of what we term in the industry abuse. Abuse is the technically correct use of the products we build to cause harm. It generally has very little in the way of a technical component of, there could be technical components in trying to get around anti-abuse systems, but for the most part, the people who abuse each other online are doing so by using the products correctly, but harmfully. The top of the triangle is basically everything that all of us in the room have dedicated our lives to, are up there, right? And this includes me. And in fact, something I've learned over the last couple of years is that I wasted a lot of time thinking that complexity was the interesting thing of all of these issues. And so let's say, even within the InfoSec world, let's zoom into that triangle of the harm that causes the people from traditional InfoSec, of the traditional subversion of systems to break confidentiality, integrity, availability. If we zoom into that triangle, what you still see is a fractal issue here, in that the biggest issues that actually cause harm to people in the InfoSec world are quite simple, right? The number one reason that people's information is stolen online, absolutely number one with a bullet, not even close, is the fact that people reuse passwords everywhere. Those passwords get stolen, and then credentials stuffed into every site on the web. There's nothing at all close, possibly from statistically, to the amount of information that is stolen via that one specific issue. And this is especially true if you look at the entire account lifecycle of all the issues that come up with people recovering their accounts, of their emails being stolen, of the fact that still today, if one key account is taken over, that creates a huge effect on your entire life, that your entire digital life can all of a sudden be subverted. That is still a huge issue. When it comes to machines actually being broken into, the vast majority of issues are really just around patching, right? One of the most important actual intrusions, network intrusions the last couple of years was the Equifax hack. The Equifax hack was a Apache struts bug that was not installed because the company didn't have good change controls, did not have good risk management, did not understand where their information was, and had bad patching processes. There's nothing that technically interesting about it, just a bad guy got lucky that there was something very simple going on and were able to exploit it. Simple configurers, so there's an entire small industry of people whose entire job it is to scan Amazon S3 all day to find private information and then to report it out, right? That kind of like simple, the cloud has actually been good for security in a lot of different ways, but the fact that it gives you all of these guns that you can shoot at your own feet means that a significant portion of people will shoot their toes off. That is what's happening in a lot of cloud computing environments. Old classic application vulns. So if a piece of software is actually exploited via a vulnerability that is custom tailored for it, it is almost certainly a class of vulnerability that existed for years. The Capital One breach, one of the biggest interesting breaches of the last couple of months, is because of an SSRF bug that allowed them to access the AWS metadata service. That is an issue that people have known about for years and years and years. Nothing really that interesting. And then you get at the top, basically everything we're talking about here at this conference, right? And then at the top of that are actual O-Day attacks, right? So if you imagine the top pixel of this are people using vulnerabilities or exploits or classes of bugs that have never been seen before. And let's say you could have Superman vision and you could zoom in to this screen to the top pixel. What you would see is that that pixel is actually an array of subpixels. And this subpixel represents side channel attacks for the actual impact on people's lives. Now, this doesn't mean that this research isn't good. I am glad people are doing much more interesting esoteric attacks where every 17 minutes they can sneak one bit of data out of somebody else's virtual machine on a shared processor. I think that's good. I mean, the truth is this triangle, all of those issues, especially like in the old app and the patching, those kinds of issues come from original research that ends up trickling down to being useful kinds of flaws. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't do that research. But it does mean that we need to think about the ratio of how much time we are spending on this subpixel versus the 10 billion pixels that are in the rest of the triangle. And if you look at the program of this conference, or basically any academic computer security conference, you will see the ratio is probably not exactly where it corresponds with the harm that is being done to people. Another big interesting issue that's going on in the industry side is that we're dealing with the fact that there's no good model for the relationship between individuals in democratic countries, their governments, and the tech companies that have become, in effect, quasi-governments. Now, it turns out the entire history of Western philosophy in political science is about fighting over this issue, right? About the idea of the self, about what kind of self-determination an individual has, what responsibility they have to society, and what kind of controls do you place on governments. And a colleague of mine at Stanford, Daphne Keller, at Stanford Law School, likes to talk about how the internet has kind of overturned all of these fights that we have had for hundreds and hundreds of years, and the consensus that we ended up with in a number of advanced democracies. She likes to use the term that there's a irrational exuberance for speech control now, partially because the internet has really changed the kind of fundamentals of the arguments we have been making for years and years. The way I like to talk about this is to bring it into engineers is to talk about this issue as an optimization problem. And everybody here knows like the classic engineering optimization problem, right? You can have something done fast, correctly, or cheap. Pick two of these three things, right? Optimization problem, you pick a point within this triangle, and that's your decision of how you want to balance these equities. Well, it turns out when you're talking about platforms that have billions of people, the control of their speech, the responsibility to keep people safe, this is a much more complicated polygon, right? And the equities are all important, but they're also all opposing. So unfortunately, the optimization problem here is not only difficult, but it's poorly understood. So in that triangle, it's pretty easy to understand the fast, cheap, correct. But in the situation where you're running a multi-billion person communication platform, for example, the decisions you make if you move towards any of these equities often can mean you move away from other equities in a nonlinear and unpredictable fashion. And this is the fundamental challenge of some of the geopolitical issues that we're dealing with right now, is that this chart is not understood by anybody. It's certainly not understood by the media and the politicians who like to criticize us, but it's not even understood by the people in the room. And there hasn't been enough discussion about the fact that we're going to have to make hard choices on this. There's a little bit of a crack in the wall, where people are starting to get this. The Wall Street Journal last week, I believe, had an interesting article about how Facebook is now under an FTC consent decree that obligates Facebook to stop people from scraping public data, right? So there's this big interesting argument of, if I can publicly go to a website and see something, is it worse if that data is all collected into one place and then again leaked via an S3 bucket, right? And effectively the FTC is saying that's a horrible thing. It's a horrible thing if people can collect data that is otherwise available from an individual perspective into one place, and that information might leak. At the same time, the FBI is hiring companies to scrape Facebook so they can go look for white supremacists, right? And so this is the exact problem, in that our government is both saying to companies, you have an absolute responsibility to stop the FBI from doing their job. And this is the sign of a very dysfunctional political discussion about what do we want as a society. And a big chunk of this is due to the fact that the tech companies have not been proactively honest about what's going on. The fundamental truth is that every major tech company has a huge number of people who are working very, very hard right now to make the internet as bad as it is right now. So as bad as the internet is, as much harm has happened, as big as that triangle is, it would be significantly bigger if there weren't thousands of people working in trust and safety and investigations and law enforcement response teams and the other kind of teams that find and stop bad guys and perhaps every once in a while get them arrested. The scale of this problem is actually difficult to discuss because the companies don't release numbers about most kinds of abuse. One of the only situations where we have good numbers, a class of abuse, is around the sexual exploitation of children. And that's because there is an organization chartered by Congress called the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children that is allowed, and in fact required, to gather up reports of bad things that happen to children online, and to gather up all that information, to coordinate between the companies, and to report statistics out. And last year was called the Cyber Tip Line, which is effectively an API that allows tech companies to report bad things happening to kids. Got 18.4 million tips in 1 year in the United States alone. 18.4 million. That's a big number, right, for a country of 340 million people, right? That is a horrible number, and each one of these stories is actually pretty horrible. In fact, as we meet right now, as we sit in this room, there are 1,000 people, or I'm sorry, I think it's like 3,000 or 4,000 people, at the worst hotel in Dallas, Texas, at a conference called the Crimes Against Children Conference. And these companies, these are the tech companies, are all represented there. They're running a whole track of discussion. And these are the sessions that are happening right now. So this is from today's schedule. While we stand here, as of right now, these sessions are still going on. This is the reality of the world we live in, right? Is that we live in a world where a talk called Pediatric Strangulation, a Multidisciplinary Response, has to be repeated because it's so incredibly popular, right? This is something that the companies don't want to talk about, is the fact that the world is a dark place and that there's a significant percentage of people who want to harm other people. That has existed forever, right? That has been true forever. But the internet allows them to do that in new ways. It allows them to do it from thousands of miles away. And sometimes it allows them to do it, if they have decent technical skills, in a way that is effectively impossible for law enforcement to catch them. And the fact that the companies don't proactively talk about this is part of the reason why we have the problem with my big star, is that because we don't talk about the trade-offs, it is impossible for policymakers to make intelligent decisions. And you don't see this issue with other industries, right? The oil and gas industry makes it very clear, if you make it hard for them to pull gas out of the ground, gas prices will go up, right? There's arguments to make gas prices go up, a lot of good arguments, I think, but at least the trade-offs are understood. But in the tech industry, because we want to present this future that everything's bright and cheery and happy all the time, we don't engage the world with how it really is. And the truth is academia is not engaging the world with how it is. And that's one of the things I'll talk about in a second. Another big issue is we are collectively not learning from our mistakes. So as Dev said, I spent a little bit of time as the Chief Information Security Officer of Yahoo. And shortly after I joined Yahoo in 2014, we dealt with an intrusion by this institution. Anybody know whose institution this seal is for? It's Russia, but like, anybody want to get more specific? There's got to be some Russian speakers here. FSB, yes. So this is for the FSB, the Internal Security Bureau. There's 3 main intelligence agencies in Russia. The FSB and SVR are the descendants of the KGB. FSB is focused on domestic issues as well as the former Soviet states. SVR is spying overseas. The other totally different one is GRU, which is military intelligence. GRU was the one that was mostly involved in the US election. FSB does a lot of oil and gas stuff, right? So FSB is interested in breaking into American companies that have access to data either on Russians who are dissidents or journalists, or on stealing data about the oil and gas industry. The FSB was very interested in data that was being held by Yahoo. And so they put a team on it. And this team is actually, you would think that these guys are like uniformed military members sitting in a closet, but actually not, right? This team is actually run by this guy, Alexei Balon. Alexei's not Russian, he's Latvian. And the story that I was told by an FBI agent was that Alexei actually used to hack into a lot of Russian companies. The FSB caught him, and they said, so my friend, you can work for us doing hacking on our behalf, or you can live out the rest of your short life in this little concrete box. And he chose option A out of those 2 options, and chose to work on behalf of the FSB. And so Alexei runs a hacking team that both hacks on for financial benefit of himself and his people, but then also does work for his uncles at the FSB. And this was a multi-month intrusion. It was a very difficult one for us to root out, and I'll talk about some of the root causes of why. But this is an intrusion that we fought for many, many months at Yahoo, eventually reasonably successfully. But by the end of that, they had able to abscond with some database backups of the user database, and within those user databases were a bunch of different encrypted hashes. Now, those hashes, while probably hard to crack en masse, certainly could be cracked on an individual basis, and that puts individual people at risk for their information at Yahoo being accessed by the Russian government. One of the outcomes for me personally of dealing with this is that I have now been questioned 5 times under oath or under penalty of perjury about this incident. 3 times in civil lawsuits that were filed against Yahoo and Verizon, the company that bought it, twice by a combination of the FBI, the SEC, and the FTC. This is not an experience I can suggest or recommend to the young people in the audience, but it is quite possibly if you end up being in a position of any kind of influence within an industry, it is likely a situation you will have to deal with. I'm looking at Eric Gross from Google right now, because I know he has been at that table too. Depositions are a very interesting thing. In a deposition, you have been compelled to answer questions. You don't get to claim the Fifth Amendment, right? You don't get to take the Fifth. The Fifth Amendment only applies to your own personal criminal liability. So you can't say that you're not going to answer questions. You are required to sit there. And there's lawyers from, in this case, the class action plaintiffs who are asking questions. There's a court reporter who's writing stuff very rapidly. There's a video camera on you. And then there's a whole table of lawyers representing all of the different interests, right? So I have my lawyers. I've got lawyers from Yahoo, lawyers from Verizon. Effectively, collectively, the room was probably billing around $10,000 an hour, and I was the only one not getting paid to be there, which is a lot of fun. I probably spent through those 5 interviews 30 to 35 hours in those interviews, and about probably 100 to 120 hours preparing for those interviews. That's fine. This is my responsibility. I had a position of responsibility. It is my responsibility to tell the truth about what I observed and what happened. Those lawsuits and those investigators interviewed dozens and dozens of people. So collectively, they did thousands and thousands of hours of interviews and thousands of hours of investigation of what happened at Yahoo. I'll tell you a quick story about a fun little tip. You've got to be very careful about what you put in an email. Let me just tell you, young people. Because the way this whole thing starts is they send a request to the company to give them all the email with certain keywords in it. And then they look through all those emails, and then they give you this huge binder, and they make you go through the binder and read to them on camera with the stenographer typing. They make you read these emails out and then explain what you were thinking at the time, which can actually be quite difficult to go back years and years and to put yourself back into place. There's one email that stands out very particularly for me that I got questioned about. And it's because, like I said, this was a multi-month issue for us to deal with the FSB. During those months, I actually broke my knee. I fractured my kneecap. I tore up a bunch of stuff in my knee. I've had 3 knee surgeries. The 2 I had in high school were due to a soccer injury and taekwondo. This last knee injury was because I fell off a ladder putting up my Christmas lights. So that's what aging is, kids, is that you go from soccer injuries to your wife looking down at you on the ground saying, why the hell did you get up on the ladder to put up the Christmas lights? Now your knee is broken. And so I was crutching around for most of the incident response that we're dealing with, delaying my surgery because we were in the middle of an incident, right? And I couldn't take a week off. We finally kicked these guys off the network, and so I go in to fix my knee before I'm permanently lame. And my surgeon's like, I can't believe you're delaying. I don't know what FSB stands for, but what I can tell you is you're not gonna be able to walk again unless you get this thing fixed. So I finally go in, I'm in the surgery. I'm sitting in the hospital. I've got an IV in my arm. They've put something in it. And my phone vibrates, and I open up the phone, and there's an email. And it's an email from a consultant from McKinsey & Co. who had been hired by Yahoo to figure out people at the company who were not critical and could possibly be laid off to increase Yahoo's bottom line. So this is a spreadsheet of some of my best people in the middle of, we have just finished incident response against the FSB. And they've got this list of people who are non-critical. So I've got literally 45 minutes before I'm about to go into surgery. I feel like it's important for me to take care of this. I end up forwarding to my boss. My boss was actually quite a nice man, effectively the CTO of the company. And so now the experience is that I'm sitting years later at a deposition table, and there's these lawyers across from me, and there's a video camera, and there's somebody typing, and they ask me, Mr. Stamos, please turn to tab 46. Yes. We'd like you to read this email out loud to us. And so I sit there and I have to read this email. And the experience is me going, Jay, why the F am I looking at a effing spreadsheet from an effing McKinsey consultant who doesn't know anything about effing layoffs in the middle of a GD incident response? It goes on like this. Now, I'm actually saying the words, and after every sentence, the lawyers stop me, and they say, so Mr. Stamos, why did you say that? What were you feeling at the time? I'm saying, well, in this first paragraph, I'm explaining to Mr. Rossiter my concern for the allocation of resources within Yahoo Incorporated. So anyway, that's what a deposition is like, is every little email you write, every text message gets thrown up against you. But this is a good process, right? Actually, Yahoo made mistakes, I made mistakes, the company failed. This is good. As a society, we should spend thousands of hours figuring out what happened and learning from it. And what was the output of thousands of person hours, of interviews, of investigation, of review of email, of all this? The entire output was that these lawyers asked for $35 million, $50 million for all the possible people who were affected, which is much less than $1 per person. It's about 25 cents per person, per potential plaintiff, and nothing else. As a society, nothing else that came out of this whole process ever became public. The story I just told you is the only email you will hear of from the thousands of emails that lay out all of the fundamental issues that happened at Yahoo that led to that breach. And it's because our society isn't set up to fix these things. Our society is set up to divvy out blame. Can you go with her? To divvy out blame and to make lawyers rich, right? We're not set up to actually make anything better. And that's a real fundamental problem. Other industries don't have this problem, right? And this is why we end up with the same bugs over and over again. The last couple of years, we keep on having these bugs where people are storing passwords in plain text. This isn't because these people are stupid and think it's okay to store passwords in plain text. It's because in a big distributed system, it's extremely likely at some point that one of your engineers will be debugging a problem, and they'll turn on full parameter logging, and they'll log passwords and not know it, right? All three of these major companies, Microsoft, Twitter, Facebook, had the exact same problem. In none of these situations was any kind of major, every single one of these companies, I guarantee, did a massive internal deep dive into the root causes of the problem. They analyzed exactly what went wrong, and they figured out how they're going to fix it. None of that is public. And so as a result, for the next 10 years, every 6 months, you're going to see this exact same headline, right? Because as a society, we're not learning. Other industries have figured this out, right? I know people are like, oh, security is really hard. Well, you know what else is really hard? Is like hurdling millions of people per day through the air at almost the speed of sound and getting them to places safely, right? That's what the airline industry does every single day. And one of the reasons, if they were as good at security and safety as we are, half of you wouldn't be here because you would all be dead trying to fly to Santa Clara, right? And the reason why they're so good at safety is because they look inward. Every time there is a problem, they do deep, deep dives into it. And so if there's a major incident, if there's an incident that has like a whole loss or some kind of casualty at all, then there's a national group, the NTSB, that does a deep investigation. In these cases, if you look, you can't really see the details, but it takes, in some cases, a year to do an investigation in some of these cases. And then they write a multi-hundred-page report that everybody can read and everybody in the industry can learn from. Almost this amount of work probably happened in the Yahoo breach. But this outcome didn't happen because the benefit is that some scum-sucking class action lawyer gets to buy another boat in Miami, right? It's not that here's 500 pages that everybody can learn from. And even for close calls in aviation, they're able to deal with this. So in situations where a bad thing didn't actually happen, but something almost happened, there's an entire system by which people who are part of aviation are supposed to go report it themselves. They get legal protection, right? So they can't be prosecuted or punished for the information that they give over. And they are highly motivated to go and to self-report, and this makes the entire system better. This is actually kind of a terrifying, this is public, you can go to the ASRS, you can go to this database, and this is a real incident from SFO recently that talks about a 787 having a significant issue on landing. But the reason why this didn't end up with anybody dying, and 99.99999% of the time these issues don't end up with any deaths, is because of this kind of self-reflection, which is something we don't have. And something we don't have in industry, but the bigger problem is we don't have a legal system that makes this something that people want to do. And the truth is that you only hear about 10% of the breaches, maybe 5% that happen, because the only situations in which people are required to talk about a breach is when personal information has been exposed. The vast majority of information, you are not that interesting. The Chinese don't actually care about your data, right? The real qualified, high-skilled adversaries want information for industrial espionage. They want long-term intellectual property. They want to know about what is going on from an intelligence perspective. So a small portion of the breaches are the things that we discuss. And so as a result, we're not learning at all from those incidents, and we're not getting better at these things. So I'll give you my lessons, like if there was an NTSB report. These are things that I think would come out of Yahoo versus the FSB, just some quick lessons for you guys to take into your jobs. The first is that when you're talking about at-scale technology, just like a shark, if you're not moving forward, you're drowning. One of the challenges at Yahoo is that Yahoo had to effectively invent web-scale computing in the late 90s all by themselves, right? Before David Filo took on this problem, nobody had ever handled 1 million concurrent users. Like, you can do that off of an Android phone now. But like at the time, handling millions of concurrent users into a dynamic web app was something that nobody had ever done. And so Yahoo had to invent all these technologies, all these key value NoSQL databases. Yahoo invented Hadoop, right? So Yahoo invented a whole set of technologies around data warehouses. But as a result, when you look at Yahoo's network, things that any other company would do just by pulling Redis and MongoDB and Hive and a bunch of other stuff off of GitHub and then putting these well-understood components that are patched and are part of a community together, Yahoo built themselves. So Yahoo was, at the time I joined, effectively, almost all of it was custom code that was built at Yahoo for Yahoo. And unfortunately, the company had spent decades not investing in that technology of effectively hiring engineers to reverse engineer what the people had done before them so they could pray to these secret systems. Like the user database was not based upon some well-known NoSQL database. It's this code that had been built at Yahoo because at the time Yahoo did it, nobody built a database that was a distributed NoSQL database, right? Like they didn't even exist. And so as a result, that made it incredibly hard to do security because all of the time, 95% of your attack surface is all custom code, right? Whereas a vast majority of the attack surface for most companies are well understood pieces of technology that you can secure. The second is that a tech giant being responsive to Wall Street is actually a really bad thing. While I was at Yahoo, we picked up a thing called an activist investor. This person's claim to fame was that they had turned around the Olive Garden. I'm not kidding. That had been like these investors had taken over the board of the Olive Garden, cut the number of breadsticks you got, and made it a profitable business. And so that made them believe that they knew what was best for a platform that was serving hundreds of millions of people and holding sensitive data on hundreds of millions of inboxes. As a result of this activist investor, Yahoo became very, very focused on the bottom line and on making decisions that would make the numbers look good every single quarter to keep Wall Street happy. That is a very dangerous way for companies to think. There's a lot of discussion now about whether founders of companies should have overriding voting control. And I actually say yes, because the only thing worse than a megalomaniacal founder controlling a company is Wall Street controlling a company, right? In fact, I think tech is too responsive to Wall Street. I think one of the fundamental problems we have in the tech industry is that at all the big public companies, the executives are mostly paid based upon what Wall Street thinks of them. Around 80% of my compensation at Facebook was pegged to the stock price. And so as a result, we end up being too responsive to the financial concerns and not responsive enough to the long-term thoughts about what's important for people. And the third, this is more of a personal thing. If you have an IV in your arm, turn your phone off. That just turns out to have like meds for pre-surgery is not something that you want to recount at a deposition or to an FBI agent, it turns out. So back to like kind of the big picture issues. Another fundamental issue we have in the Valley is that people are trying to scale the culture. Like a big deal at a lot of companies is that they believe that the core culture that got them there is still the thing that is important for them as they become companies with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of employees. But unfortunately, while they do that scaling the culture, they end up worshiping the past a little too much. There's a great blog that I recommend you guys all read called Stratechery. A guy named Ben Thompson, he also has a podcast. And he had this great post several years ago about the curse of culture, right? He basically says, and he's quoting a number of business philosophers here, that culture is the thing that allows companies to operate, right? A corporate culture means the CEO doesn't have to go around and tell every person, these are the decisions I want you to make today. The culture informs those decisions, right? If you have a strong corporate culture, everybody kind of knows what they're supposed to be doing, and therefore the company works in a much more efficient way. But there's also a real problem here, in that as companies are successful, by definition, they look back at their culture and they say, the culture is why we succeeded. And they don't differentiate between the things that actually cause their success and perhaps the side effects or the irrelevant parts of their culture that now need to be discarded. And so they end up becoming rigid. And the way that expresses itself at Silicon Valley is you end up with veneration of engineers who have been there a long time. You have these people who talk about, man, this company was so much better. We were in that little office and there's 500 of us and everything was great then. And that's fine to talk about the past being better. It's a little dismissive of the thousands of people that you've hired who are now making you rich by you alienating their labor to be a bit of a Marxist. But, you know, okay, if you want to be a jerk like that, that's fine. But where it gets really dangerous is where the veneration of the past becomes a veneration of the decisions made in the past. So at Facebook, this was a real problem. And it was a real problem because the veneration of decisions that were made back in a time when Facebook was effectively the life support system for Farmville were not relevant for when Facebook became the world's most important political discussion machine, right? When Facebook ended up carrying more discussion about politics than any other media really in the history of the world. In fact, I would argue that today, Facebook and Google together have a stronger stranglehold on on the flow of information worldwide than any organization has had since probably the Roman Catholic Church pre-Reformation, before the invention of the printing press, when the Catholic Church controlled what was history in Europe through the fact that books had to be copied manually, and that our entire view of the ancient world is actually filtered through decisions that were made by individual monks, like in the 1400s, of what they're going to keep and what they're not. Right? The invention of the printing press was an incredibly democratizing step for information, and in many ways, Google and Facebook and other companies have been democratizing that people have voices, but you end up with this massive centralization of who controls those printing presses now. And that's an incredibly big responsibility. And with that responsibility comes a responsibility to rethink the decisions of the past. And I think that's a problem that lots of tech giants have, is that they believe that the decision that they made in 2008 that led to them all becoming millionaires are the right things now. And the truth is that when the facts change, the decisions have to change as well. And that's like a real corporate culture issue that we're dealing with in the Valley that's hard to fix. It's funny, because you wouldn't hear in Silicon Valley, people are too conservative or interested in the past. We talk about disruption and such all the time, but that's not actually true at these companies. And I think that's a fundamental problem. Another article I think you should read actually just came out yesterday. It's about some of the same issues at Google. I think this part is really interesting, is the idea that supporting and protecting divas, difficult but brilliant employees, is a good thing and is something that scales. And I think that's actually, no company is more influential on modern Silicon Valley corporate culture than Google, and this is one of the things that Google has given the rest of us that I think is bad, right? I think actually the supporting of 10 times divas is something that leads to really bad decisions being made, and that leads to really, really poisonous corporate cultures that can't adapt and that don't have the ability to fix it. Anyway, this is like 10,000 word article, so take your time on it. But I think this is hopefully, because of the kind of self-reflection, this is something that we're going to be able to shed a little bit in the Valley. And then another key component is that the key to predicting harm, and that big part of that triangle, right? So in the InfoSec world, we have a kind of a mental model of the bad things we want to stop. We use the CIA triad and all that kind of stuff. But we have an idea of what it means for people to change the execution of a program to do bad things. We don't have a good mental model of what abuse is, right? The understanding of abuse really comes with empathy for the people who use the products. And the key to having that empathy is a diversity of backgrounds and experiences. Look around this room right now. Look around, go ahead, take your time. Yeah, this is not America. It is certainly not representative of the world. Something like 4 billion people are walking around with pocket supercomputers that we slipped in there with always-on internet connections. And these are the people who are figuring out what it means for those folks to be harmed or not. That is a fundamental problem, right? The lack of diversity in industry and academia, the lack of voices from the developing world especially, mean that we have these humongous blind spots where there are entire classes of issues that we don't even consider because they're not compatible with our own personal experiences. And so there's a couple things to do here. The first thing is for us to obviously do lots and lots of work to diversify our industry, right? Like we need to make this a lot more open field for people. We need to make it welcoming. We need to welcome in people with different kinds of backgrounds and different kinds from different areas of academia. The other thing I think is a positive thing I think, and I want to give USENIX a shout out here, is we also need to build structures for us to think about these problems in more thoughtful ways. That instead of things just being based upon people's personal experiences, that we have some intellectual structures for understanding what harm and abuse is online. And I think these conferences, particularly from USENIX, are both notable for the diversity of the speakers on stage, for the diversity of the attendees, and for them tackling issues that are very, very practical and that are not the kinds of things that 10 years ago you would ever expect at an academic security conference. In fact, Pepper, which just ended, I believe was this week, turns out this is unofficial, but is the most gender diverse conference in the history of USENIX, right? So that is a huge accomplishment, and the whole USENIX team should be very proud of the work they're doing, and I hope the rest of the industry kind of takes a look here of the benefits that you get from this kind of thinking. Okay, so what can we do in academia? Now, I'm going to say we now that I work in the shadow of that big tower. Couple things. First, I think we need to make sure the incentives in academic computer science are adjusted towards harm, not towards complexity or headlines. So one of my favorite papers from this week is actually this one, Privacy and Security Threat Models and Mitigation Strategies of Older Adults. This is effectively a paper capturing all of our experience, which is every single person in this room has had to clean malware off of a computer during Thanksgiving break, right? Every single person in this room has had the experience of sitting down with an older, generally male member of their family and really wondering how could they possibly have 2 different crypto lockers, 3 different search engine hijackers, and 2 different background processes that are tapping into the microphone, fighting over control of the Windows kernel. God help me, what websites was this person visiting? And then trying to mentally bleach that thought out of your mind and just focus on the technical side, right? Every single one of us has had that experience. This is an entire paper studying the issues of the safety and security issues for older folks. And I think that is incredible work that does not fall within the normal definition of what is a CS hard problem. What is the kind of thing that you can get a PhD for? The other kinds of talks, I say this is a talk from Enigma. This is a very interesting talk by Ashkan Satani, all about the different processes that go into thinking about the ways your technology can be abused. That kind of process focus is really, really important. We talk so much in academic security about the outcomes, and there's so little study of the way software actually gets built and the mistakes people make on the way. And I'd love to see more and more looking at how we get there, because the truth is the outcomes are things that can be fixed. That doesn't mean it's not bad research, but the process issues are the fundamental things that end up with all those outcomes. And so if you move up the scale, you can find choke points that if you fix those choke points, you end up avoiding these problems in the first place instead of trying to patch them out one by one. I think academic computer science needs to really focus on supporting other disciplines. So the truth is for the vast majority of people who work in technology, they are not the product, they are the plumbing, right? For the vast majority, every single company in the developed world is now effectively an IT company. One thing I heard when I was at Facebook, we had these CTOs and CSOs visit from a variety of different companies. They would always do these Silicon Valley tours to go see how Silicon Valley companies make technology. And a bunch of these companies, banks, retailers and stuff, had more software engineers than Facebook did, right? They were effectively software companies. Software is eating the world, is revolutionizing every part of industry. But this doesn't really hold in academia, where computer science is still all about the computer science. And that's fine. It's great to study computer science for computer science sake. But I think the other thing folks in CS need to think about is how are you going to support other disciplines in dealing with the fact that computer science won, right? The number 1 major at Stanford is CS, and I know that's a real pain in the ass for Dan Bonet and the other folks who have to teach undergrads. I mean, I'm from public school where they say no to kids, right? I'm getting used to this idea that you can't say no to students who pay $51,000 a year. It's a weird thing for me. Or give Bs. It turns out that's a thing. I'm not kidding. I was at DEF CON last week, Black Hat. I had a dinner. The mother of a student brought up the fact that her daughter got a B+ in my class last year at dinner in Vegas, right? So it's not theoretical. But anyway, that is a great testament to the importance of technology in people's lives, that students are choosing to take computer science classes. That means the research should follow, and a bunch of the work computer scientists should do should just be like the technologists who are out in the world who don't do technology for technology's sake, but use and help with technology being used for human advancement. And so 3 people I'd like to call out who are doing great cross-disciplinary work in this way. Jennifer Pan, she's in the communication department at Stanford. She's one of the world's experts in the Great Firewall of China and the way that Chinese propaganda networks work. Combines a bunch of different parts of sociology, psychology, communication, and computer science. You have folks like Gary Warner at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. Gary does the most practical academic research into the bad things that happen on the internet, bar none, right? He has built this incredible powerhouse program that really should be reflected at the top 20 CS universities, but isn't yet. And then folks like Kate Starbird, who has like a traditional CS background, but who's also combined it with her interest in how people actually use products and actually get harmed online. This kind of work, I think, is really, really important, and we need to make space for people to get PhDs, for people to get awards, for their refereed papers to get accepted, for people to be able to do computer science work that supports other people in understanding and fixing the world, not just to push forward the limits of computer science. And we need to bring these lessons back to the classroom. This is a really interesting piece of research recently, in that these folks at this private security consultancy found an issue that has existed over and over again, which is a bunch of the most important dating applications, especially in the LGBT community, all have the issue that by faking your GPS location, you can triangulate the fine GPS location of everybody on it, right? This is a well-known flaw. Tinder actually had this bug. I believe Uber even had this bug a while ago. And yet, these kinds of lessons are not making it back in the classroom. If you graduate, even from a top CS program, you don't understand the real kinds of harms that can happen from this kind of stuff. Because this isn't actually a CS hard problem. It's not a traditional security issue. It's a combination of kind of data protection and understanding the societal issues that affect people like this and the users of your product. That combination is not really reinforced in the undergraduate world. So this is where I'll give a pitch for the work we're doing at Stanford. We have this new Internet Observatory, and with the support of Dr. Bonet, we're actually putting together a class that focuses just on these kinds of issues, that focuses on all the emergent issues of the internet and all the different kinds of abuse that fall outside of traditional information security. We're going to open source all this content. I've got 18 people from industry who are helping build it. So we have people from Microsoft, Google, Facebook, NCMEC, Thorn. We have an FBI agent. So we have a lot of people with practical experience who are putting content in here. We're going to open source all that content. We're looking for academic partners who want to teach it after we get the content done. So if you are interested in perhaps bringing this class to your school and collaborating on it, you can give me an email. So in summary, we've inherited the earth, right? The people in this room won, security has won. When I was an undergrad at Cal, there was no undergraduate security classes. I had to take a graduate class, actually, from David Wagner, and he was a grad student himself. I think he had just decided that he wanted to teach it. It wasn't something that was seen as a real field in the 90s. And so you have David and Dan and other people in the early 2000s building out undergraduate security curriculums. And security has clearly, we've spent decades telling people that what we do is incredibly important. So now we have to kind of live up to what we've told people, right? Is we've told people we're the high priests of what happens online. We understand the bad things that happen. And so we're actually going to have to get there. And we're going to have to make sure our work is tied to people's real lived experiences, not to our belief of what are the bad things that we want to hunt down and what are the kinds of problems we want to work on. So let's work together on this. Let's work with industry on this, and let's kind of live up to the expectations people have of us. The one thing that makes me really happy about what's going on right now is the students, because every single undergrad who has come to one of my office hours wants to talk about how to make tech better. Every single one of them, right? They don't ask, how can I make the most money? They don't ask me, where should I work that has the best snacks? They ask me, Alex, I'm looking at different jobs. What can I do to actually make things better? And so there is a real desire from our students to make the world better. Let's help them do that. Thank you very much. I think we got 5 minutes if anybody had any questions. There's some microphones here if folks, yes, sir.
So thank you, Alex. I enjoyed hearing a beating for academia. I can add a whole bunch of stories to it. Yeah. But it still seems to me that you had a fundamental blind spot. And that is that a lot of the stuff that we here actually has been weaponized by industry today, by good, well-meaning people who come up with ways to justify using all these side channels that you say are useless to track us, to fingerprint us, to collect data on us, that seems to be at least as much of the problem as all these other issues.
Yeah, first off, I'm not trying to say anybody's research is useless. I think all the research is great. I just think when we think about the incentive structure we set up, the incentive structure should push people towards things that have real impact. And USENIX is actually a great example of this. All of those papers that were discussed, who won the awards, all of the papers that have stood the test of time, actually are talking about people's real problems. There are other conferences and kind of academic fora in which I think complexity, I had the hardest I'm getting points for the difficulty score or the kind of the way people judge. I agree. I mean, there is a continuous problem of the ideas in academia that are meant to be doing good things being turned. That is the entire history of machine learning, of every machine learning paper has at the end, these are the positive societal things you can do, and in the end, all of their work ends up making ads more efficient, right?
Best.
And so I don't have a great solution there other than, for people to think about those kinds of things. I mean, I think less of that in security, I think that more in the ML world, that they really need to have to struggle with the work they're doing and to think about, if I was going to make a profit off of this, how would I use it? I don't think that goes into most people's calculations. Yes, sir.
Remembering your security threat pyramid from the beginning, some of those big threats are pretty easy to fix, like patching. That's just stupid. But
patching's just stupid. So, who here has ever had to patch more than 1 million servers? Eric, hand up. Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
I take that back. I'm sorry. But no, the real question.
It's not just like you let Windows Update run and like, oh man, I got to reboot. Right. Like it's tough.
It does seem like a problem that should be easier to solve. But passwords is actually interesting. What do you think about solving that problem? Yeah, so, I mean, we're just in this crazy world where, as everybody in this room knows, the username password paradigm comes from like 1970s timeshare architectures, right? And we're still using it in 2019 with pocket supercomputers, with all these biometric sensors. I think the movement WebAuthn is great. I think the movement towards federated identity is good. I understand the privacy trade-off. This is one of those hard equities. In the end, though, normal people are not going to be able to maintain credentials for hundreds of different sites. So moving to a federated identity model that still preserves their security, but then also provides like some, because it's not just about their authentication credentials, but there's so many situations with their actual physical identity are important. So I think we need to move to a model where the identity providers are able to provide some level of nuance of this is how sure we are that this is this person, and that there can be step-up authentication. That is in a privacy-preserving way that people can do that. That's a great use of all kinds of crypto ideas that have come out in the last 10 years. The hard part is the account management lifecycle, right? So it is easy to replace passwords at the moment of authentication. What is actually hard in industry is the craziest shit happens to normal people, right? They're like, I lost my laptop and I lost my phone because my backpack was stolen in the airport. How do I get my life back, right? Those kinds of situations happen. And I think the other thing we need to think about is the network effects. One of my colleagues at Facebook, Brad Hill, was working on this, of how can you build networks of companies that kind of allow you to prove identity to one another to kind of recover your identity slowly. I think we got to think about those kinds of things and about much more use of step-up authentication and risk-based authentication where we allow people to authenticate in different kinds of ways and then treat them in different ways. And I don't think, there's not a lot of good kind of mental models of how to do that, but I think that's the future we'll move to. I think this gentleman is first.
Very nice talk, Alex. So
Thank you.
In the beginning portion, you highlight that the tremendous fraction of the things we deal with are abuse-oriented. And none of those problems individually are very hard to deal with. It's that scale makes it very difficult to actually deal with.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious if you have thoughts, given this to an academic audience, about a way to improve academia's engagement on these problems of scale. Because the reality is there's a handful of people in the audience here who are successful at engaging with Facebook or Google and able to work with data sets of scale. And this is a data-intensive problem because you need to see all the full things that people do. And that's actually a very small fraction of our community who can engage. And so what is the answer for harnessing academic research on problems of scale when very few people here get to look at data at scale?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of the funny things is there's only a handful of kind of open, nonprofit projects that operate at any kind of reasonable scale. Like Wikipedia being one of the only examples of, in the Alexa top 20 of something that is, a nonprofit that's open to working with people. So I think, one, we need to try to find those situations and utilize them when they exist, right? The handful of situations in which they don't have the commercial concerns. This is actually something that's going the wrong direction on the current privacy debate. None of the privacy discussions take into any other equities. Like one of the fundamental problems of GDPR, to get on my high horse a little bit, is that there's this problem of what's called competence in the EU, that the European Commission, European Parliament does not have what's called national security competence. They are not responsible for national security. So as a result, they promulgate privacy rules at a European level that then affect the security and safety decisions that are being made at the state level, and there's not a good process for the German cops to tell the European Parliament that all of a sudden they can't do their work anymore because GDPR means that their tech partners won't work with them anymore, right? And that is happening all over the place with the FTC consent decree that happened with Facebook. The word academic research, the word research does not show up anywhere in there, right? And so I actually think we're moving in the bad direction here in that the definition of what is right for people, there's a very, very specific definition of privacy that has nothing to do with actual harm and only has to do with data protection and kind of control of data. And that is an important thing, but it is not the only thing. And the fact that we are moving so aggressively in that direction means that the big companies are going to become more insular, more monopolistic, are going to have less competition, and there's going to be less work for less ability for academics to understand what's going on. I think we need to have projects to push back on that and to create safe spaces for the companies. Another colleague at Stanford, Nate Pursley, in the law school, is working on this. It's called Social Science 1. And he's working on a project to effectively allow academics in a FTC and GDPR compatible way get access to real data. It is incredibly hard, and they're not succeeding so far. And so finding projects like that at multiple universities and then publicly talking about the need for carve-outs in any laws that pass in any of these legal agreements to allow academics to do important work in privacy-preserving ways is important. I think publishing more work on how can you use things like differential privacy to allow you to do this kind of work without details is also going to be important. But unfortunately, it's actually the thing I think that's trending the wrong way, to be able to do at-scale research. And I think this is the last question. Yeah.
I'm wondering if folks from the business school or the law school are taking CS 152, or if you've thought about cross-registering it.
Yeah.
The multi-point triangle that you showed has a lot of really interesting trade-offs. And some of us in this room think about those, and as you mentioned, there are no easy answers to many of them.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the decisions that get made are driven a lot of times by profit, data collection, getting people to click on more ads, and even the settlement that you mentioned. You sort of alluded to the scummy class action lawyers, but Yahoo has lawyers too, and a lot of those are business decisions. Like,
right.
Let's settle this and let's make it go away, rather than continuing to pay legal fees or see this come to light.
Right.
So the companies themselves have a responsibility as well to bring some of that to light. And I would say that I hope that because a lot of the people making these decisions in these companies are not engineers, but are lawyers and business folks, I hope that they're taking your class as well. And I hope that you consider cross-listing it and reaching out, because it seems incredibly useful.
I totally agree with everything you said. The companies, it is totally in their best interest to settle stuff instead of to have their dirty laundry out there. You're right. Like, I'm getting kind of irritated. There's every month the Atlantic or New Yorker or some kind of old East Coast magazine likes to publish something by a liberal arts major about if only computer scientists had taken more liberal arts classes, the world would be a better place. The least ethical people I've ever met in my career all had fancy Ivy League JDs and MBAs, right? They weren't engineers. And so you're totally right that that's an issue. The 152 class, eventually we will have a version for them. I am teaching this thing called the Hack Lab, which is a introduction to offensive security techniques for non-CS majors, and it's cross-listed with law. So effectively, I teach lawyers how to use burp proxy and Metasploit and stuff like that. But the goal is to teach them some of the underlying technologies as well. So I totally agree. And then that's also, I think, something that academic CS can do is to go volunteer to teach those classes, right? I know it's tough because everybody here probably has oversubscribed classes, and so it's hard to then go volunteer to teach 10 or 12 2Ls or 3Ls, but I do think that is important.
Yeah, that's really good, and I think it's really frustrating. I think many people in this room have done expert work, and you as well, to see the truth get buried in the interest of the bottom line is something that we see happen all the time. But it's not us that are making those decisions often. It's the lawyers or the people who are in charge of the bottom line.
Right. So there's a couple fundamental issues. There's the companies over-legalize their decisions, and so they look to legal and PR risk as their guiding light in the way they make these decisions. But then also the incentive structure is messed up, right? There is no incentive to come out like the ASRS system I showed. There is no incentive to ever say, we had a near miss, right? We had a breach, but we caught it. Nobody ever announces that. And so we also need laws to pass to create penalties for people to not talk about this stuff, but then also to create safe harbors so they can. Because right now what happens is if you said, I had a near miss, you will end up with a class action lawsuit even if there's no real consumer harm for a variety of, probably for like shareholder stuff, because you didn't say exactly, I'm gonna have a near miss in your last 10K. And so you'll get sued over that. And so we have to change the legal structures so that people are incentivized to be honest and open and not incentivized to hide things. Anyway, thank you so much. Have a great show.